My talk is called Hybrid Working, which is a bit of a kind of poncy title, but it just need to make it sound good. Basically, I'm going to be talking about how you kind of work with different media at the same time. And I suppose I was kind of, the reason I'm doing it is because a lot of the other talks are all quite computer program based, or looking at one program. And this talk is going to try and take a sort of broader picture, particularly for undergrads who still do a lot of development work by hand. It's how you can really enhance your hand skills using a bit of work on the computer and sort of marrying sort of hand drawing, model making with computer technology at the same time. Some of the stuff I'm going to say is really, really obvious, really common sense, but actually people are really bad at obvious stuff. They tend to overlook it. So if I'm sounding really obvious, just sort of think if you actually do that in practice. So yeah. Right. So it's basically this kind of thing which I'm going to talk about. This was my drawing board last night. So on there we've got this laptop, there's a drawing underneath, there's paint, there's a folder, there's books. Basically, it's no good working on one thing at once. It's highly unproductive, just streaming us into one way of thinking. It's also really, if you just work on one thing at once, just follow that through. If you hit a blockage or a stop or get stuck, then your whole process dries up. If you work on lots of things at once, if something gets stuck, you just have a break from it, move on to something else. Also, if you work on lots of things at once, if you're reading, if you're doing models, if you're working on the computer, things start to cross-fertilize. Ideas crisscross between, and sort of everything just works better. This is basically the things I'm going to cover in this session. Now, some of it does look very obvious, but hopefully I'll give you a few sort of just basic tips, just to make life quicker and easier. So the first thing we're going to talk about is photographing models, which again might sound really obvious, but we'll see. This is a model photo of mine from the start of third year. As you can see, nothing special whatsoever. It's a pretty scrappy site model. Now, I think if you're going to make site models, you should either make them really scrappily, really quickly, or you make them bloody amazing. Anything in the middle is a bit of a waste of time. If it's scrappy, you can do it quickly. If it's bloody amazing, you can use it for the whole of the project and use it for your presentation at the end. Now, in this case, this was a scrappy, fairly quick model. Another thing I just want to point about this is a really, really bad photograph for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's loads of clutter in the background. That makes your life really, really difficult when you bring it onto Photoshop, or if you need to edit it in any way. It just makes it much harder to cut it out. Another thing, I've actually spliced two photos together because I didn't even take the photo and get it all in on one shot. Sounds obvious, but if you just do the basics well, it makes life easier. Another really important thing is the lighting. This side of the model is totally in shade. That side's overexposed, really bright sunlight coming in from the studio window. Again, it just leads to a really nasty image. Having said all that, it is a model image, and we can still work with it, which is what I'm going to show you now. This is something I did in my third year. No, it's not. I'm going to jump to this and then come back. This model image is slightly better. For a start, I've got a fairly neutral background. I don't have the clutter. I've got most of the model in. The main thing that's wrong with this image is we've got multiple light sources. So there are confused shadows. So the shadows going this way from one light source, there's more direct shadows. There's all kinds of crazy things going on. And that is basically because this model was just photographed with strip lighting. Fluorescent lighting is the worst lighting to photograph a model with, because it just gives it a sort of ambient brightness, and when you've got lots of strip lights, you're getting multiple shadows. So the best thing when it comes to photographing models is get it out of the studio. Whether it's going up to Pete Levy, whether it's taking it outside using natural sunlight, which works really, really well. you should always have one light source when photographing a model. Pete Lady's got really good lights up in his room that you can use, a bedside light, a desk light, anything other than these lights here. So that's kind of what's the main thing that's wrong with that image.
Martin?
Yes.
Can I interrupt and suggest that sometimes I find two light sources really useful?
Yeah, I mean, you can play around with it. If you want to play out the shadows, yeah, then by all means go for more than one light source. Put lights in the model.
Yeah, I recommend two desk lamps. One to be the sun, and one with a bit of tracing paper over it from the other side, so you don't black out bits and models with shadows that are too...
Yeah. I mean, it's playing around with it, but basically you just don't bear in mind how many light sources you have. One will work. More than one, you've got to be careful. These guys, definite no. Having said that, if you have taken an image like this, we can still manipulate it on Photoshop and get it looking something more like that, which is significantly better. Now that image was done in about 3 seconds. Basically, there's 3 very clever things on Photoshop: auto levels, auto contrast, auto color. They don't always work, they work about 80% of the time, but they will clean up an image, just make it sharper, bring up the color very, very quickly.
Bring that back again.
I'll come back to, that's the difference. That's when it's photographed, and that's what it turns into. Just with auto levels, contrast and color. And I think I also just blacked out the background. I'll come back to those at the end if there's time. Another thing, photographing models, this is photographing development models. This is again from 3rd year. People who work with models a lot and go through a sort of process, it's really good to take the same photo of a lot of models, make it an iterative process so you can see how the thing's developed. So that involves using a tripod. They're not hard to get hold of. Pete has them. It's good practice to use a tripod for taking any model photo because it takes away all camera shake, and that just sharpens up your image. So really you should always use a tripod, but in this case it's absolutely essential so you can get exactly the same view. And it just means it's really clear to see in this kind of plan view of the model how the thing is developed over time. Next thing is how you can use models to actually make 2D images. If you've made a site model at the start of your project, it's a complete waste of time then making a site model on SketchUp or any other 3D program, unless you have loads of time. If you make one type of model, basically you should use that for the whole project. Otherwise you're just doing the same thing twice in slightly different ways. So in this case, if you have made a physical model, we'll go back to this one again. As I said before, it's a really bad image, but we can still work with it. So what I'm going to show you now is how you can turn this model into a drawing. And again, this is from my 3rd year. It's not that great, but it's quite an easy thing to do. First of all, you take a photo and simply just trace it. Now, this was done on Illustrator, which just with this pen tool here, so if you click on it, you just draw around the image. So you just trace off it. It's really, really simple. You can also do it by hand with a bit of tracing paper. The reason I did it on the computer was to save printing costs, because I wanted to get an A1 drawing out of it, and I didn't want to have to scale my photo up, spend £4 or whatever printing that out just for a trace over. So that's why I did it on the computer. You can do it with CAD programs, there's lots of things that'll do that for you. The good thing about on the computer is then it's vector-based. You can scale these lines, so you just simply scale it so it fits on an A1. If you do it by hand, you've then just got to scan it in and go blow it up a little bit slower. So you can see that we've gone from this to this fairly quickly. And it's a very basic trace, but the idea is you can then add more and more detail. And then what I did next is I blew it up to A1, printed it out, and then worked it up again by hand. And it ended up looking like something like that. So it's a little master plan drawing, talking about the site and where the building is, and connection to this river down here. And then that was scanned back in again so I could play around with it at different sizes. Next, this is giving life to the humble sketch. A lot of people work heavily in their sketchbooks, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is sketchbooks are chronological, and most people tend to have quite thick sketchbooks. And as you work through a project, you quickly forget what came before. So you have some really nice simple sketches at the start of your project and get completely forgotten about by the end. Also, sketches can be really, really good at expressing an idea very simply. So, for example, here's a sketch. Again, it's third year. This is a very quick 5-minute thing. Don't know when I did it, just in my sketchbook, buried away. I had an interim review for this project in 3 weeks. 3 weeks after doing this sketch. And I didn't want to spend loads of time drawing a beautiful sight drawing. I just wanted something really quick and simple to express an idea. So what you can do is if you scan this sketch in, you can then very quickly on Photoshop just put a blue bit to show the water. Very quickly you have a diagram that will explain what the project is about. The building's here, these arrows to connect them to the community. I don't know, there's a nuclear sub on the river that sails up and attacks something up here, whatever you want. It's just very quick and simple. It's not drawing what's over here, it's not drawing what's over here, that's not important, but it just sells the idea very, very quickly. And that's just from a quick sketch. And you can use that process, you can develop that further, you can have a series of these sketches, different colours showing how the thing evolves. It's very, very quick to do. This was a drawing I stumbled across yesterday, again showing how you can take almost quite crude, simple sketches and turn them into something that will explain a project. So it's basically what you see is what you get. The advantage of scanning something like this in, which I'll touch upon later, is that you don't even have to draw all these at the same size or on the same piece of paper. So you can scan different drawings in, you can cut them out, you can assemble them on Photoshop and move them around. And the colour is just very simply just applied on Photoshop, just with the Sue tool, making a layer, filling it, and toning down the opacity. The next thing I'm going to talk about is scanning drawings. I was going to show, let's see if this works. Actually, no, I'll come back to that. I'll do that at the end. I was just going to show a little demo of how to work with scan drawing, but I'll leave it to the end to come back. This bit is perspective views without SketchUp. See Jay grinning. SketchUp is really great. I'm not having a go at SketchUp, but I'm just saying this is another way of doing it. A downside of SketchUp is that you can spend ages modelling your whole building when all you need are 2 images. So this is why I'm showing you this. Here's a sketch. It looks pretty sketchy. Something that people do all the time when thinking about their projects. This is a perspective sketch looking out of a foyer area to gardens and college looking down the end. If you take that sketch, either photocopy it, scan it in, you can then begin to add to it over time, work it up. So what I'm saying is, a lot of the final image I'm going to show didn't come from sort of one big idea and then going and do it. It was something that evolved throughout my whole design process. So this was sort of one of the early sketches exploring this idea of views out. And as the project evolved, I sort of realized that this was a really key drawing to sell the project. So rather than sort of designing what this bit of the space looked like over there, I just focused on this and what you would see in this drawing. So the next slide just shows how, by drawing on tracing paper, scanning it in and overlaying on the previous version, you begin to work up the sketch, add more details, so put people in, suggesting what the ceiling, what the floor is, that kind of thing. And when you've got that, you can then begin to, what I'm going to show is sort of how you can develop a sort of montage technique using Photoshop. So this slide is just beginning to put a few textures on, a few shadows, a bit of context in the background. And instantly, just doing something that simple, you begin to really get a feel of what the space is like. If I just show it with other different layers turned off, this is sort of alternative. So here I'm just highlighting the grass. And immediately, once, all I'm doing is finding a bit of grass and collaging it on. It's not very difficult. But if you sort of do that enough times, add people over where I have people shaded, you can just keep working it up slowly. You can end up with something looking more like that, for sort of whole image. And if you probably can't see, but if you look really, really closely, you can still see the traces of the sketch that were there already, there at the start. So it's a drawing that's progressively kind of evolved over time.
You draw those windows in with just white with a transparency in it.
Yeah, basically, all you need to do, it's not complicated Photoshop. I'd say my Photoshop breakthrough came when I mastered how to use all the selection tools, so all the different types of lassos, how to add to a selection, how to subtract from a selection. That and the opacity tool, you can kind of basically do this. Throw in a few other of the brush tools just to darken bits up, and that's basically all you need. It's not very difficult. It's just, the thing that takes time is just finding the textures, the images, cutting them out, stretching them and fitting them on. Again, a similar example, this time even more primitive, really, really early, basic concept sketch of what I wanted this approach for you to look like. Revise that as we begin to develop it. It's still the same kind of idea as what there was before. This bit at the end, this wing coming forward. You can't quite see the wing coming forward, but it's the same. It's basically the same sketch, just worked up, the same view. Let's go that way. Again, this is sort of the final version of that drawing. So all that was just worked up by hand, drawn on tracing paper, so you can trace over what you've done before. So I'm not redrawing the drawing, I'm just working back on top of it and drawing it neater and exploring different things each time. And just refining constantly.
How long did that particular render take you?
I haven't got to the end yet. Then again, like the previous example, just start putting textures on to highlight different bits, and you can end up with something looking like that. How long did it take? I mean, doing sketches, that was something that was developed right the way through the design process. The actual sort of physical sitting on Photoshop, collaging it, probably, I don't know, a day maybe?
Mm-hmm.
2 days?
Find those trees on the internet somewhere, we could cut all that out.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways. I mean, the magic lasso tool is really quick.
For really accurate sort of leaves, hair, things like that, alpha channels, and learning how to use alpha channels to master things is a really good way to do it. I'm sure we can cover that in a specific seminar, but yeah, there are ways around it.
My next example, this is the title I gave it. I can't use CAD, my sketches are rubbish, my models are crap. It's basically for anyone who saw all the previous images and was like, I'm never going to be able to do that. Well, you might be able to do something like this. So my answer to this question is, well, learn how to trace. I learned how to trace really, really well. So this is a drawing, the beginnings of a drawing that I did last year. And all this is just traced simply by hand onto a piece of tracing paper from a printed image. So this is the Arts Tower. The printed image was this, which I got from
Emerson Live Maps,
which you can get 3D bird's eye views of buildings. So all I did was get a series of those and trace them. Again, I could have done it on the computer, but for this drawing I specifically wanted a kind of hand-done, kind of cartoony look. And that turned into that. And the thing to say about this drawing, this was a drawing we did as a studio for our exhibition, end-of-year exhibition. And the thing to say about this drawing is that it wasn't composed in advance on paper. It was just traced separate buildings. And I think I took up about 4 A1 pieces of tracing paper. But then, again, just using Photoshop, cutting the buildings out and just moving them around, it means you can try different configurations, different layouts, and just compose the whole drawing. Because obviously with hand drawing, you have no edit undo. And so if you just get the basic images and then you can play with them and get sort of arrangement you liked. Again, this is another drawing I did last year when time was short. This actually is using a SketchUp Model J, but it could have been done from another model, it could have just been a sketch. This is the work in progress drawing. I've got a wire line underneath, which was a SketchUp model, which I've exploded like an isometric. And then what I did, having done the SketchUp model, I printed it out, just as wireline. Now you might think printing out drawings when they're not final drawings is going to get a bit costly. Yes, it is. So you can see on this scan, I've actually pieced together 4 A3s to make an A1. Because it's not going to be a final drawing, I just need it as an underlay that I can draw back over. And then what I did after that was lay a piece of tracing paper over the top and just sketch over it what my project is. So everything in red was sort of interventions I was making into this building. And this was, again, just really quick, maybe an hour, one evening, just mapping out kind of what the drawing was going to be like. I think that's a really important lesson. All these sort of big, nice drawings take time and you need to plan them. And unless you're a genius, it's very difficult to come up with the drawing you want to do off the top of your head. You normally have one idea of the view, then you need to sketch it, you need to think about it, you need to compose it, and you also need to see it at the scale that it's going to be at the end. That's why I printed this out A1 and not A3. And then I did a reworking of it, traced it up, and it ended up looking like that as a final drawing. And that's just the drawing scanned back in, laid back on top of the SketchUp model with a few labels. And as you can see, it's a really, really cartoony style, very simple, stick people. It's not complicated drawing, but I've just put a lot of detail into it. Right, how are we doing with time? Maybe I'll finish and then show a few Photoshop tips.
Yeah.
Does that seem okay? I think this is my last slide. This is a drawing of Naomi, also in my year. A similar kind of collage effect. What she's done here is she worked a lot with models in the design process. So the base image of this kind of building thing, that was from a model photograph. She then took it into CAD, she just traced it using lines like I did before, printed it out. And she really likes working with paint and oil pastel, that kind of thing. So she just printed out the wireline at A1, which is really cheap. If you use Pete Lady's copier, it's about £1. Onto tracing paper, and then she just rendered over the top of it. Then she scanned it back in, put it onto Photoshop, and just touched it up. So these are kind of my kind of key lessons, I suppose. Auto levels, contrast, color, and Photoshop. I'll show you that in a minute. Photography, always use tripods. Direct light source, or being really conscious of the light sources, sort your background out, work on lots of things at once, draw on tracing paper. This one's important here. It's alright to copy other people's drawings, or to like reuse them, interpret them in your own way. And the only way you can do that is by keeping your eye out and building up a resource of drawings that you really like. And there's set precedents. And the best way to do that is just go to the library, flip through journals, look at Jay's websites, look at the internet, that kind of thing. And just get a sort of a spectrum of drawings that you like, and maybe you want to do something similar. And then at the end, just good images take time to do, so don't leave them all to the end. And that's why, as you go through a project, if you can decide quite early on images that you think are important, and you can work them up as you go along, it just makes life easier at the end. It means you might end up with an image that you've got 3 or 4 previous versions of. And basically, don't just see your final drawings in isolation, use them to actually help you design at the same time, because then you're killing more than one bird with one stone. So now I will maybe just show a few of the kind of Photoshop things that I mentioned as we went along.
Has anyone got any questions for Martin at this
If
point?
anyone's any questions, yeah, throw them in.
Anything at all, doesn't matter how silly it sounds.
Is there any way of drawing a dotted line in Photoshop? Because at the moment, like, I have to transport the image into Illustrator for a dotted line.
I don't know,
I don't,
to be honest.
don't
Normally,
think there is.
Basically, use the paths. You use the paths instead of layers, and then mark it out with pen, and then stroke it with a brush. Make the brush dots or like lines
We can come back to it later. That's quite a technical question. I don't want to get bogged down in it. I'll come back to it afterwards. I just want to show a few more kind of general things that might be useful to everyone.
Martin, just before you move on to Photoshop, I was just wondering with sort of earlier sketches, do you have to make a decision at that point that it might not change that much? If you're working it up during the project, is there not a worry that you might completely change some ideas and then that becomes redundant as you're doing it?
Maybe, but I mean, often there's kind of really key things you might want to show. And there's nothing wrong if there's any changes. You can just have two drawings or a drawing that's sort of got made up of different pieces. I don't think that's a really big problem. What I'm going to show now is, it's probably not going to be so clear on screen, but basically this is that cartoony drawing I showed earlier. And this is one of the scans for that drawing, of the hand drawing that I did. Now it's going to be a bit difficult to see, but when you scan drawings, the scanner always sort of distorts the colours slightly. So that's one of the first things you need to clean up. Also, when you scan drawings, it's important to try and get them straight on the scanner. It sounds basic, but it just means you don't have to fiddle around in Photoshop. There's now a colour A1 scanner in Roy and Melbourne's room. It costs about 40p to scan on. It makes life incredibly easier. Before they got that, I used to scan A1 drawings by using an A3 scanner and a bit of masking tape and sticking sort of 1/4 of the drawing onto the scanner, using masking tape to keep it straight, scan it, and move on to the next one. Now you don't have to do that, which makes life much easier. What I was mentioning earlier about the auto levels, that's one of the first things you can easily try and clean up. So that's an image up here, adjustments, you've got auto levels, auto contrast, auto colour. They don't always work, but kind of 80% of the time will make some difference. Do you notice that go whiter? Or was it not very clear? That's what it was before. Can you see that difference? So you just have to go through, do your contrast, do your colour. You can also do it manually if you want to play around with the levels. You've got this level thing. I mean, I don't know the sort of technical what it actually does, but you can
I think we can.
darken it, lighten it, adjust the contrast, that kind of thing.
I think we can go through the specifics of curves, adjustment layers, and so forth in another seminar if anyone's interested. But I think we should just try and cover the basics really.
Okay. So once you've got you've done that auto levels, contrast, colour. The way I began to sort of arrange the images, you just use the lasso tool. You cut around them. Now, you can cut right around the actual image, but you don't actually need to if you cut it out, turn it into a new layer. Now say I want to put that building closer to this building. You see how there's a big white bit obscuring that? That's really easy to get rid of if you use your blending options in your layers palette. It's nearly always on normal. If you change it to multiply, it does that. And that's really, really handy for line drawings. So it means you can begin to overlay, if you want to overlay it, you can move with that.
So it's also really handy for textures. If you're putting a texture on, you want to see the line work underneath, or you want to put a shadow layer on, and you want the rest of the building to show through. Multiply that bad boy, and there you go.
So that's basic kind of cutting out moving drawings. That's kind of all you need to know. Another really useful thing, let's open the other example. Something I didn't know for ages. Right, I've just taken this image and turned a lot of the layers off. This is another image from last year. I get on the floor layer, that's this bit here. When you're using the lasso tool, see you've got this feather up here. Normally that's set to 0. Most people don't even bother changing it. And when it's at 0, if you select, like I'm selecting a bit of floor, I'm going to delete it like that. It just gives me a straight, really clean cut. If I change that feather to 10, do the same thing. See the difference? It softens or feathers the edge. Now why is that useful? It basically, when I do those big montages I showed you before, I normally have it on a feather of about 2 or 3 pixels, depending on the size of the image. But what it does is it just softens. When you're doing a collage which has lots and lots of layers and images taken from different sources, if you do a clean cut and sort of marry 2 things up or overlap, it can look quite harsh. Whereas if you use a feather of sort of 2 or 3, it just softens the edges and helps the 2 to blur together.
If you had an image and you were really, if you wanted to be older, could you put like a clipping mask on that?
You could do, it sounds a bit complicated. I try and keep my Photoshop simple. Another couple of quick tools which are really useful, which again you might not know about, are these guys here, Dodge and Burn. And they're really useful for sort of finishing touches to any kind of Photoshop collage. The Dodge tool basically lightens areas of the image. And what you can do, you've got this exposure up here. And if you have that 100%, we do it on the floor, it basically kind of, you see it lightening it. And it's really good to sort of give lighting effects or shadows. If you're merging 2 different layers together and you need to get the tones more similar, just use that. And as you bring the exposure down, it does it less. So it's quite good to work with low exposure and just use it like you use a paintbrush to sort of get the right kind of effect. And the Burn tool basically does the opposite, and that darkens. So bring that back up. See, that's darkening. But you can quite quickly, just using those, change the whole sort of atmosphere of a drawing.
Martin, do you think that's a bit easier than using the layer masks?
I don't use layer masks.
Oh, yeah.
This is where I show you that I don't actually, there's loads of things about Photoshop that I don't know. That's probably a really good point to end on, actually. Photoshop's one of these programs that there's about 5 different ways of doing the same thing, and every person has their own way. And you can actually learn loads by just working side by side on computers on similar images and just watching what people do. And a lot of these things I learned in practice while working on a competition with someone else who, he didn't use layers at all. He kind of just used all the brush tools and I used all the layer tools. And by kind of realising that and just asking a few questions, we were really able to broaden our knowledge of the programme.
Can I just...
On that note, I think I'll wrap up.
I'd just like to thank Martin for doing a great talk.